Greenleaf and the Black Blade, a serialized adventure podcast by Andrew Israelson. Episode 8, My Heart is Chambered with Many Worlds. Johannes Bruckner, flushed from his victory in the field of blood, exited the arena, the crowd's cheer still ringing in his ears. As he walked back through the portcullis, he saw Rixton, the trainer, looking mildly impressed. "Nice job out there, lad. Perm's far from our best fighter, but he's certainly no slouch. You didn't even let him touch you with that mace of his. I must say I'm impressed." She gestured for him to follow, and they began walking down the tunnel, the crowd's roaring still ringing at their backs. "Come on, let's get you to Braden and get you paid." They walked back to the office. Braden looked up briefly from his work and said, "Good work, boy. I popped up for the end of the fight. Looks like you had it pretty well handled. Either that or some very lucky swings." He tossed Bruckner a heavy bag full of coin and said, "Come back if you want another go. No doubt the crowd will be slavering for you now, so I do hope you do come back. There'll be more honor and money in it for you." He returned to his paperwork and said, "Rixton, take him up to Waynfield to get him his prize." On the way out, Rixton explained, "Braden and I are team trainers, you see. All fighters need a team backer. We get a cut of the arena's profits, and that's what your payment here is taken from. But the hall itself awards a prize to each warrior who wins a fight. So let's go get that for you. You really ought to come back, you know. Braden is a prickly sort at the best of times, but I could tell he likes you." The Andoli woman led Bruckner up a winding stone staircase to a fat man sitting behind a counter overlooking the arena field. "Waynfield, here is the Black Blade come for his prize." The corpulent man turned, looking very excited. His mustaches were heavily pomaded and twirled, and he reeked of perfume. He glowed at Bruckner, saying, "Oh, wonderful fighting, my boy, wonderful. You are getting an exciting prize." He pulled from under his desk a pair of carved golden statuettes. They formed two lions that would fit into the palm of a man's hand. "These are ensorcelled lions. Simply speak the command word." He wrote it down on a piece of paper to avoid saying it aloud. "And they will become full-size lions, willing and able to fight by your side." Bruckner accepted the prize with thanks, bade Rixton farewell, and left the arena. He had barely stepped outside of the entrance before Tadalak leapt on him, saying, "Wow, Ox, you were amazing! The man with the shield tried to—" He jumped off of Bruckner, pantomiming the swings of Perm. "But then you—" He then adopted a noble stance, and pulling his new dagger from his sheath, sliced and stabbed at an invisible foe. "And then it was all over." He grinned happily. Bagor thumped Bruckner on the shoulder. "Ah, I knew I'd picked the right man. Well fought, boy. Well fought indeed."
"My thanks, boys. Buy you a drink? Bagor knows just the place."
They cheered in assent and all headed back in high spirits to the Drunken Dragon. Nima, meanwhile, had gotten the hang of the repeating crossbow she had purchased at Lyle's Emporium. She had been training with Solarin, the youngest of the Elvish sisters. The new mechanism allowed bolts to be fired at a much faster rate, and fortunately they were able to hook up the repeating mechanism to the existing frame given to her by Mordecai. Armed with a new and improved weapon, she and Solarin had headed to the Drunken Dragon to meet up with Bruckner and Tadalak for dinner before she had to rendezvous with General Alexander for her special operation that evening. Nima arrived at the Drunken Dragon at almost the precise moment that Bruckner, Tadalak, and Bagor arrived. Upon seeing her, Tadalak raced up and gave her a leaping hug around the middle, then stood back a bit bashfully, before proceeding to describe Bruckner's fight in vivid detail. Bagor nodded in approval as the gnome retold the fight, occasionally adding in bits and pieces of his own in a booming voice. Bagor managed to usher them all inside as the story unfolded, and by the time it had ended, they were all sitting around the table with mugs of ale in their hands and the promise of hot food on its way. Solarin was visibly impressed by the whole party and asked Tadalak many questions about where he came from and what his adventures had been like so far. He told a few choice tales with gusto, eliciting many laughs from the listeners, as well as a sense of admiration for the pluck and nerve of this tiny fellow, wandering the world much on his own these past 3 years. She then looked to Bruckner and said,
"Well done, winning a fight in the arena on your first day in town. Think you'll be able to take on the Grey King one of these days? Also, you must all tell me more about your adventures of late. Life in town is dreadfully dull, and I always like to find the adventurers and hear their tales."
Bruckner seemed at a loss for words, hesitating long before answering. Noticing this, Nima stepped in and said,
You mustn't press Bruckner too hard about his triumphs. He's one of those very good people who dislikes idle boasting. Perhaps you might like to tell us some tales yourself, Solarin.
Solarin blushed and said,
Oh, I really have nothing to tell at all. Running a shop isn't as exciting as it seems.
She was amiable company, however, and she and Tadalak talked the night away about the strangeness of humans, while Bagor laughed uproariously, getting steadily more and more drunk. Over the course of the evening, several patrons came up to congratulate Bruckner on his win and offer to buy him a drink. He accepted the praise humbly, but limited his alcohol. When the sun set, Nima rose, said her goodbyes, and left to meet with General Alexander as per his request. Solarin also bade the group a good night, returning home. You said you could read Tevianite, right, Ox, in addition to speaking it? Tadalak asked Bruckner. The swordsman nodded. When we get back to the inn, perhaps you will help me with this book. He pulled the small leather diary out of his bag, the one that Nima had found on the corpse in the room holding the trolls under Mount Ellisbor. It's written in Tevianite, if you recall, which we both read fluently. But it's also encoded in a cipher, and it looks like a tricky one. And maybe if we put our heads together, we can see what it says. He looked around furtively, then whispered to Bruckner so that no one else could hear them. The first few lines aren't encoded. It belonged to a man from Velth. There must be some information in here that will be of use to us. He looked at Bruckner expectantly. Bagor, who was 3 sheets to the wind by now, heard the two talking and interrupted loudly. Oi! So you ready for another fight tomorrow, are you? The crowd will be wanting more of you after your showing today.
You arrange it. I must go sharpen and oil my blade.
To Tadalak, he said quietly.
Yes, let's see to it.
Meanwhile, Nima was heading through darkening city streets. The setting sun glowed amber and orange against the copper walls and sandstone towers. She arrived at the military encampment and found herself outside of General Alexander's tent. One of his squires announced her, then re-emerged, instructing her to wait. After 5 minutes or so, the tent flaps parted, and the general stepped out, smiling.
Ah, Miss Nima, thank you for coming. Please enter.
He held open the tent door, allowing her to enter. Inside, she immediately noticed a gaunt man standing in a darkened corner of the tent, leaning over the general's table, studying a document intently. General Alexander seated himself and said,
Nima, may I introduce Xavier Heartstone? He'll be handling the charges against King Genesin. He's also tending to some local concerns.
Heartstone straightened up, turning his head to study the half-elf maid. He was dressed in a long, midnight blue cloak with a full hood. The top half of his face was obscured by a silver mask etched with intaglio half-moons. His mouth was a dour line set over a sharp chin.
This is the one?
He asked the general. Alexander nodded stoically, taking a small sip from a glass of wine. Heartstone looked at Nima seriously and asked,
You walk in the shadows, yes? You know how to move unseen and lie when it suits your purposes?
Nima considered for a moment, then answered,
I have cultivated certain skills that might serve me in times of need, yes. But I have not done so to unquestionably serve any who ask. I would need an appropriate motive to employ their use.
Nima noticed no perceptible change in Heartstone's demeanor, but he turned his head ever so slightly to the general and said in a dangerously soft voice,
I'd best control your pet, General.
The general stood swiftly, his face a hard and unreadable mask, and gripping Nima's arm, led her to the edge of the tent. He spoke in a low voice.
You must follow his instructions. You've signed an oath of allegiance to me, and through me to Savar. He speaks for Savar at the moment.
Nima thought the general's face soured as he said this, but less than a moment later the expression was gone.
Mind your tongue, and remember your place,
he said, his eyes deathly serious. He walked back and resumed his seat, beckoning her harshly to follow. Nima narrowed her eyes at both the general and Heartstone, but said compliantly,
What would you have me do?
Heartstone examined his nails as he spoke. His voice was of a slightly high pitch, and as cold and unforgiving as a frozen lake.
Perhaps you have heard of a dangerous sect of heretics located here in Enchulich. call themselves the Doorway Walkers. They're led by two creatures named Panthelon and Martonius, whose nature is something of a mystery. The two men, if men they be, are discorporate, at least some of the time, and their bodies form a sort of bridge or doorway to other planes of existence, hence the moniker adopted by their followers. Such magics are not uncommon in certain parts of the world, of course. Though these are no Andoli nor the Herastic Schismatics, they're something unique and relatively new. They appeared in the city last autumn and have been steadily gathering neophytes to themselves. They preach an ecstatic creed, promising to tear the veil from before the worshippers' eyes, through violent visions to see behind the world, beyond the gods, an immediate experience of the totality of the divine. They promise salvation.
A violent sneer twisted his features, and his voice glowed like a brazier as he said,
Blasphemers.